A rainy Tuesday evening at a bustling grocery store in downtown Philadelphia. Sarah's cart was filled to the brim, and as she fumbled for her wallet at the checkout counter, she noticed the elderly gentleman behind her. His weathered hands held just 3 items: a loaf of bread, milk, and some basic medicine. His eyes showed a weariness that spoke of a long day, maybe even a long life of challenges. Without hesitation, Sarah turned to the man and offered to add his items to her bill. It was a simple gesture, one that many might make on any given day. But what happened next would unravel a story that neither of them could have imagined, connecting two families across decades of Philadelphia history. The man, in his late 70s, introduced himself as Mr. Thompson. As Sarah helped him carry his groceries to his car, they shared small talk about the neighborhood, the weather, and how things had changed over the years. That's when Mr. Thompson mentioned something that made Sarah freeze, a detail about the old Victorian house on Cedar Street where he'd worked as a groundskeeper in the 1960s. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The house he described was her grandmother's childhood home, a place that held both cherished memories and painful mysteries. For years, her family had tried to piece together the story behind a collection of old photographs found in the attic, images that hinted at an untold chapter in their family history. As they stood there in the parking lot, the rain now just a gentle mist, Mr. Thompson began sharing stories about the house and its residents. Each detail he recalled seemed to fill in another blank in Sarah's family puzzle. But it was when he mentioned a hidden room behind the library wall that Sarah's eyes widened. Her grandmother had always insisted such a room existed, but no one had believed her. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. Here was a man who could potentially unlock secrets that had haunted her family for generations. As Mr. Thompson spoke, Sarah realized this chance encounter wasn't just about a few groceries. It was about connecting two pieces of history that had been separated by time and circumstance. But what truly sent chills down Sarah's spine was when Mr. Thompson mentioned a specific painting that used to hang in that hidden room. It was a detail that matched perfectly with a story her grandmother had told countless times before she passed away. Could this elderly gentleman be the key to understanding her family's past? Their grocery store encounter stretched into an hour-long conversation, with other shoppers passing by as these two strangers discovered their intertwined histories. Yet, as the evening drew to a close, Mr. Thompson revealed something that suggested their connection ran even deeper than either of them initially thought. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph, its edges worn with age. "I've carried this for over 50 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it's time it found its way home." As Sarah took the photograph, questions raced through her mind. Who were the people in the image? Why had Mr. Thompson kept it all these years? And most importantly, what other secrets would this chance meeting reveal? As they parted ways that evening, both knew this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. What started as a simple act of kindness at a grocery store checkout line was about to uncover a story that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the smallest gestures can lead to the biggest discoveries, and in this case, a few grocery items worth less than $20 would unlock a priceless piece of history. But what Sarah would discover next would shake the very foundation of everything she thought she knew about her family's past. The following week, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the photograph Mr. Thompson had given her. The black and white image showed two families standing together on the steps of the Victorian house, one white, one black, all smiling, their body language suggesting a closeness that would have been unusual for that era. The date stamped on the back read, July 15, 1963. Sarah's fingers traced the faces in the photograph, lingering on a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to her grandmother. But it was the child standing next to her that caught Sarah's attention. A little girl holding hands with a boy from the other family, both laughing at something beyond the camera's view. The innocent joy in their expressions contrasted sharply with what Sarah knew about those turbulent times. After several phone calls and arrangements, Sarah found herself walking up the cracked concrete path to Mr. Thompson's modest row house in North Philadelphia. The retired groundskeeper had agreed to share more of his memories, but his voice had carried a weight of hesitation that Sarah couldn't quite understand. Inside, surrounded by walls decorated with family photos and vintage jazz album covers, Mr. Thompson settled into his warm leather armchair. His daughter, Lisa, served them tea in delicate cups that seemed to hold their own stories. "Before I tell you everything," Mr. Thompson began, his hands slightly trembling, "you need to understand what life was like back then. Some truths were kept hidden not out of shame, but out of necessity." He revealed that during his years working at the Victorian house, he had witnessed countless secret meetings in that hidden room behind the library wall. But these weren't the illicit gatherings Sarah might have imagined. Instead, Mr. Thompson described how the space had served as a safe haven for civil rights activists planning peaceful protests and community initiatives. Sarah's grandmother's family, it turned out, had been secretly supporting the civil rights movement, using their social status and wealth to protect and fund various causes. The hidden room wasn't just an architectural curiosity. It was a piece of living history, a place where barriers of race and class dissolved in the pursuit of justice. But as Mr. Thompson continued his story, his expression grew more troubled. "There's something about your grandmother's involvement that few people knew," he said, pausing to gather his thoughts. "Something that changed the course of many lives, including my own family's." He stood up slowly, disappearing into another room before returning with a small leather-bound journal. "Your grandmother gave me this for safekeeping just before she left Philadelphia in 1965. She made me promise not to share it until the right time came. I've carried the weight of that promise for over half a century." The journal's pages were filled with elegant handwriting, detailed accounts of meetings, and what appeared to be coded messages. But what caught Sarah's eye was a loose envelope tucked between the pages, addressed to the future generation in her grandmother's distinctive script. As Sarah reached for the envelope, Mr. Thompson gently placed his hand over hers. "Before you open this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to know that what's written inside might change everything you believe about your family's history. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than we're prepared to face." Lisa, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. "Dad," she said softly, "tell her about the fire." Mr. Thompson closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath. The mention of a fire seemed to age him instantly, and Sarah felt the atmosphere in the room shift dramatically. But before Mr. Thompson could continue, the sharp ring of his doorbell cut through the tension. The unexpected visitor at Mr. Thompson's door was his grandson Michael, a historian at the city's archives. His timing couldn't have been more perfect or more unsettling. "I found something today," he said, still catching his breath as he joined them in the living room. "Something about the Victorian house on Cedar Street and the fire of '65. Michael spread out several yellowed newspaper clippings on the coffee table. The headline spoke of a mysterious late-night fire that had damaged part of the house, specifically the library wing. But what caught Sarah's attention was a smaller article, tucked away on page 6, about a series of anonymous donations made to local civil rights organizations the very same week. Mr. Thompson's hands trembled as he finally began to speak about that night. "Your grandmother," he said to Sarah, "she was supposed to host a crucial meeting that evening. Important documents were to be passed along, documents that could have exposed several prominent families who were secretly funding the movement. But someone had found out." He described how he had been working late that night, tending to the garden, when he noticed unusual movements in the shadows. "I saw them," he whispered, "men in suits, trying to force their way into the library through a window. Your grandmother saw them too." Sarah's heart raced as Mr. Thompson continued. In the chaos that followed, her grandmother had made a split-second decision that would alter countless lives. The fire, it seemed, hadn't been an accident at all. It was a desperate measure to protect something, or someone, far more valuable than mere documents. Lisa disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a metal box, its surface scarred by heat damage. "We've kept this safe for decades," she explained, placing it gently on the table. "Your grandmother left it with Dad the morning after the fire, just hours before she suddenly left Philadelphia." As they gathered around the box, Michael shared another discovery from the archives. A series of coded telegrams exchanged between Sarah's grandmother and several prominent civil rights leaders in the weeks following the fire. The messages hinted at a successful operation, but the details remained cryptic. Mr. Thompson reached for the envelope from the journal with shaking hands. "Before we open any of this," he said, "you need to understand that your grandmother wasn't just supporting the movement. She was protecting a network of people who were risking everything for equality. The fire, it was her way of erasing evidence that could have destroyed families on both sides of the color line." Sarah's mind raced to the photograph, to the two families standing together, to the children holding hands. There was more to that image than just a captured moment. It was proof of a connection that someone had tried to erase. The room fell silent as Mr. Thompson slowly opened the heat-scared box. Inside lay another envelope, this one sealed with wax, alongside what appeared to be a key and a small notebook filled with numbers and locations. But it was the name written on the envelope that made Sarah gasp. It wasn't addressed to her grandmother at all. As Mr. Thompson began to explain the significance of the name, the lights in his home suddenly flickered and went out. Through the darkness, they heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the front porch, followed by a firm knock at the door. Michael quickly pulled out his phone, illuminating a face through the window that made Mr. Thompson freeze in recognition. "After all these years," he whispered, "they're still looking." Through the darkness, Lisa quickly ushered everyone toward the kitchen's back door, but Mr. Thompson remained frozen in place. "No," he said firmly, "I'm done running. 50 years is long enough." Before anyone could stop him, he walked to the front door and opened it, revealing an elderly woman whose face bore the same determined expression Sarah had seen in the old photograph. "Catherine Roberts," Mr. Thompson said quietly, "I always knew you'd find us eventually." The woman stepped into the darkened house just as the power flickered back on. Sarah immediately recognized her from the society pages of old Philadelphia newspapers. She had been one of the city's most prominent civil rights attorneys in the 1960s, and according to the yellowed clippings, she had mysteriously disappeared the same week as the fire. "I've spent decades piecing it all together," Catherine said, her voice carrying the weight of years spent searching. "When I saw the grocery store security footage of Sarah helping you with your groceries on the news, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The universe has a way of bringing things full circle." Sarah's mind raced. Their simple act of kindness had made the local news. Then she remembered the viral social media posts about random acts of kindness that had captured their interaction. Their chance meeting hadn't been chance at all. It had set in motion a chain of events 50 years in the making. Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a document that made Mr. Thompson sink into his chair. "The evidence didn't burn that night," she revealed. "Your grandmother, Sarah, she switched the real documents with decoys before starting the fire. The originals have been protected all this time by a network of people, waiting for the right moment, waiting for you." The document was a deed to the Victorian house, but with an unusual clause that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The property wasn't just owned by her grandmother's family. It was legally shared with Mr. Thompson's family through a secret trust established in 1963. The hidden room hadn't just been a meeting place. It was proof of an illegal partnership between families that had defied the segregation laws of their time. But before Catherine could explain further, Michael, who had been scrutinizing the heat-damaged box, made a startling discovery. Hidden in its false bottom was a key to a safe deposit box at Philadelphia's oldest bank, along with a series of photographs that revealed an even more shocking truth about the two families' connection. "This is why they've been watching all these years," Mr. Thompson said, his voice breaking. "Your grandmother and my family, we weren't just allies in the movement. We discovered something that would have rewritten Philadelphia's history, something that powerful people have spent 50 years trying to keep hidden." Lisa suddenly grabbed everyone's attention, pointing to her laptop screen where she'd been researching the viral video of Sarah and Mr. Thompson. The original post had been mysteriously deleted, replaced with a warning that made their blood run cold. Someone else had been watching the reunion unfold, someone who had been waiting just as long as Catherine to see these families reconnect. The sound of more cars pulling up outside broke the tension. Through the window, they could see several official-looking vehicles with government plates. Catherine's expression shifted from concern to determination. "We have exactly 17 minutes," she said, pulling out her phone, to get these documents where they need to go. After half a century, it's finally time to tell the true story of what happened that night. Mr. Thompson gripped Sarah's hand tightly. "Your grandmother knew this day would come," he said. "That's why she chose the grocery store. That's why she made sure I'd be there that day. But what we're about to uncover—" He paused, looking at the approaching figures through the window. "It's bigger than any of us imagined." The knocking at the door began again, more insistent this time. Catherine quickly typed a code into her phone, and suddenly, every digital screen in the room lit up with the same message. Operation Phoenix activated. Within seconds, the sound of police sirens filled the air, but they weren't heading toward the house. They were surrounding the unmarked vehicles outside, their occupants now scrambling back to their cars. "I've spent 50 years building a network," Catherine explained, a slight smile crossing her face. "Did they really think I'd come here without protection?" Through the window, they watched as FBI agents emerged from the police cars, approaching the unmarked vehicles with weapons drawn. The mysterious figures who had followed them were now being detained, their identities about to be exposed after decades of operating in the shadows. Mr. Thompson pulled out the final document from the heat-damaged box, a manifesto signed by both families that revealed the true purpose of the Victorian house. It hadn't just been a meeting place for civil rights activists. It had been the headquarters of an underground network of prominent families, both black and white, who had worked together to protect and relocate hundreds of people threatened during the civil rights era. But the real bombshell came when Sarah finally opened her grandmother's letter. Inside was a series of photographs and bank statements proving that several of Philadelphia's most powerful families had actively worked to suppress civil rights progress while publicly claiming to support it. The fire hadn't been set to destroy evidence of illegal civil rights activities. It had been set to protect the evidence of this betrayal until the right time came to expose it. "Your grandmother," Mr. Thompson explained, his voice full of emotion. "She discovered that her own family members were playing both sides. The night of the fire, she chose justice over family loyalty. She protected my family and others by making it look like everything had been destroyed, while actually preserving the truth for future generations." As Catherine began uploading the documents to secure servers around the world, a familiar face appeared at the door, Sarah's mother, who had received an anonymous tip to come to Mr. Thompson's house. She took one look at the scattered photographs and burst into tears. "Mom told me to watch for the signs," she said, hugging Sarah. She said when the time came, two families would find each other again in the most ordinary way. The evidence they uncovered that night didn't just expose past injustices. It revealed a network of civil rights allies that had continued operating in secret for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to bring the truth to light. The viral video of Sarah's act of kindness hadn't just been a heartwarming social media moment. It had been the signal they'd all been waiting for. But as they celebrated their victory, Michael made one final discovery that left everyone speechless. Hidden in the margin of the manifesto was a message written in Sarah's grandmother's handwriting. "The house holds one more secret. Behind the hidden room lies something even more valuable, proof that could change everything we know about the city's history." Sarah looked at Mr. Thompson, both of them realizing their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Victorian house still stood on Cedar Street, waiting to reveal its final secret. As the sun began to rise over Philadelphia, casting long shadows through Mr. Thompson's windows, Sarah understood that her simple act of kindness in a grocery store hadn't just connected two families. It had set in motion the final chapter of a story 50 years in the making. Catherine smiled, placing a key in Sarah's hand. "Your grandmother left specific instructions," she said. "The hidden room can only be opened when both families are present, and only after the truth about the fire was revealed. Are you ready to finish what they started?" The group stood together, united by a legacy of courage and justice, ready to uncover the last piece of a puzzle that had waited half a century to be solved. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the greatest acts of kindness aren't just about helping strangers. They're about healing history itself. 1 month later, Sarah stood with Mr. Thompson in front of the Victorian house on Cedar Street. The morning sun cast a warm glow on the restored facade, erasing decades of neglect. Thanks to Catherine's connections, The house had been quietly purchased and protected as a historical landmark, its true significance finally acknowledged. As they walked through the familiar halls, now filled with preserved photographs and documents telling the story of two families' courage, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how different everything looked in the light of truth. The hidden room, once a secret sanctuary, had been carefully restored, but it was what they found behind it that had left the entire city in awe. Behind a second concealed panel, they discovered an extensive archive, hundreds of letters, photographs, and records documenting not just civil rights activities, but a century of interracial cooperation in Philadelphia that historians had never known about. The documents reveal a hidden network of families who had worked together since the 1800s, protecting each other and fighting for equality long before the civil rights movement began. Mr. Thompson's grandson Michael had spent weeks cataloging everything, ensuring each piece of evidence would be properly preserved. The story had made national headlines, not just for its historical significance, but for how it all came to light, through a simple act of kindness in a grocery store that had connected the past to the present. Sarah's mother had taken charge of turning the house into a living museum, working alongside Lisa to create educational programs that would share their family's intertwined legacy with future generations. The hidden room became its centerpiece, a powerful reminder that courage often works in secret, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The mysterious figures who had tried to keep everything hidden were exposed as descendants of the same powerful families Sarah's grandmother had discovered working against civil rights. Their arrests made headlines, but the bigger story was how many other families came forward afterward, sharing their own stories of secret resistance and cooperation across racial lines. Catherine's network, it turned out, hadn't just been waiting to expose the truth. They had been protecting similar stories in cities across the country. Sarah's viral video had triggered a nationwide revelation of hidden histories, showing that the path to progress had always been paved by people willing to reach across society's divisions. As Sarah and Mr. Thompson sat in the garden behind the Victorian house, watching visitors explore the museum for the first time, they reflected on how differently everything had turned out from that rainy evening at the grocery store. "Your grandmother would be proud," Mr. Thompson said softly. "She always said the truth doesn't need to hide forever. It just needs to wait for the right hearts to find it." Sarah smiled, thinking about all the school groups and tourists who would walk these halls, learning about how two families' courage had rippled through generations. But more importantly, they would learn how the smallest act of kindness could unlock decades of hidden history. The story of the Victorian house became more than just a viral video or a historical revelation. It became a reminder that beneath the surface of every city, there are countless untold stories of people choosing love over fear, justice over convenience, and truth over safety. Sometimes it takes 50 years for these stories to emerge, waiting for the perfect moment when past and present align through a simple act of human connection. As the sun set over Philadelphia that evening, casting long shadows through the Victorian house's restored windows, Sarah realized that some stories don't really end. They just wait for new chapters to begin. And somewhere in another city, another simple act of kindness might be setting another long-hidden truth free, one heart at a time.